Presidents Obama and Pena Nieto will meet this week amid reports that the Mexican government is shifting its security strategy and shutting the U.S. out of its counter-narcotics operations. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. One of the more striking policy initiatives unveiled by Mexico's President Enrique Pena Nieto is the shift in strategy to tackle the crime associated with the country's drug cartels. In February, he promised to invest billions of dollars in social programs to address the root causes of crime. Throughout the election campaign, he emphasized violence reduction over the military crackdown favored by his predecessor, Felipe Calderon, that's resulted in so many tens of thousands dead. Perhaps most worrying for the US is the curtailing of resource and intelligence sharing between the US and Mexican law enforcement officials. On Sunday, the Washington Post revealed just how integral the US and its security agencies have been in driving Calderon's war on drugs. That seems to be changing, much to the relief of those who've long argued that the violence that has been unleashed is unsustainable. On Monday, the director of Human Rights Watch for the Americas wrote to President Obama, criticizing his administration for its complicity in human rights violations during the war on drugs. At a White House press conference on Tuesday, President Obama said he does not yet know if bilateral relations will change.
Some of the issues that he's talking about really have to do with refinements and improvements in terms of how Mexican authorities work with each other, how they coordinate more effectively, and it has less to do with how they're dealing with us per se. So I'm not going to yet judge how this will alter the relationship between the United States and Mexico until I've heard directly from them to see what exactly are they trying to accomplish.
I'm joined now by Dana Priest, the journalist who documented the extent of U.S.-Mexican cooperation in the war on drugs in the Washington Post on Sunday. Dana, there's a really interesting scene in your article from December the 15th. The U.S. ambassador basically summons the new Attorney General. This is after Pena Nieto's been elected. The new Attorney General, the new Interior Minister, the new heads of the Army, the Navy, the Secret Services, and tells them, according to officials, you say, and this is your quote, that the U.S. had been given near complete entree to Mexico's territory and the secrets of its citizens. Help us understand exactly, specifically, what that means in practical terms.
Well, it's a relationship that started under President Bush and was intensified under President Obama. And it was to help the Mexicans deal with the cartels that had sprung up when they closed the entree from Colombia into the United States via the Caribbean, and it went to Mexico. So the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the CIA, and some other law enforcement agencies became very active in trying to deepen the relationship with Mexico. And when the administration changed, they basically had to reveal to them everything that the previous administration had agreed to do with the Americans, including everything from spy planes that would fly overhead and intercept conversations to ground sensors that would also do the same thing. And in between, there were actually vetted units, they called Mexican officials, Mexican fighters who would work with particular American agencies to figure out how to raid the drug kingpins, how to find them. And they employed an HVT strategy, the high-value target strategy that we heard so much about in Iraq and Afghanistan. They pretty much did the same thing here in Mexico, thinking that they would use the military with the U.S. support, not us going on the ground, but U.S. support intelligence-wise, to find the kingpins and to either arrest them or kill them if they resisted arrest. And that would destabilize the cartels that were creating so much havoc in Mexico in the mid-2000s. And they did that. They took out probably 35, 37 kingpins, much of it with U.S. intelligence, and a lot of it from the Drug Enforcement Agency that has that portfolio, that mission here in the United States and worldwide.
And there was no concern amongst the Mexican administration, though, about the extent of involvement and how deep it went, not just in military matters. I mean, was that simply, I mean, was there any concern, or were the end goals just thought to be so similar that it didn't really matter?
Well, Mexico is not a country to be pushed around by the United States, and it took forever to get the former administration to agree to some of these things. They thought that was in their interest and wanted to beef up, do a much more aggressive campaign against the drug cartels. This administration is from the party that was in power for 70 years, but out of power for the last 15 years. They've come back with a more suspicious eye towards the Americans, and they've already told the Americans that they're going to scale back some of that cooperation, and they may even take up a different strategy. Don't go after the kingpins, do something else. The reason for that is when they took out the leadership of these cartels, the cartels went to war with one another, and that's where you saw incredible violence, beheadings, torture, people put in acid, just terrorism of the worst sort. And it was a competition for territory, for supply routes among the cartels. And so that created huge collateral damage. I mean, there's 60,000 Mexicans, many or most of them related to drug trafficking, and another 25,000 deaths, disappearances.
You mentioned the collateral damage. In your conversations with U.S. administration officials, was there any concern expressed there, not just the vast numbers of people who've been killed, but also the utter ineffectiveness of this policy in stemming the flow of drugs into the United States?
You know, there really is. Despite all of this, the drug flow is very much unabated. Demand has gone down a little bit, but really it hasn't made a big difference. I think everybody's frustrated at that, but they haven't come up with a better solution.
I'm joined in the studio by Jose Miguel Vivanco, Director of Human Rights Watch Americas Division. He's just returned from a meeting at the White House, in fact, about some of the issues we're going to be discussing. Jose Cardenas is a former State Department official who specializes in Latin American affairs. And Sanho Tree is in New York. He's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. He directs their drug policy project. Sanho Tree, actually, first of all, I wouldn't mind going back to that meeting again on December the 15th that Dana writes about in her article. This new government comes in, and then all of the chiefs of the security agencies have to are summoned to the U.S. embassy, by the ambassador, and are told, well, look, this is how it is. I mean, is it me, or does that smack a little bit of some sort of colonial era?
You know, I think that it really demonstrates the power of relationships here, and especially the response to the U.S. lecture, which was silence. You know, I think that speaks volumes.
But what do we make of it now? I mean, there was silence at that meeting, according to Dana. But does Pena Nieto mean it? We understand now that some of the plumbing that she talks about in her article, the fusion centers where Americans and Mexican officials work side by side on a daily basis and so forth, that this entire structure may be being dismantled. Is that your understanding as well, then?
Well, you know, the U.S. has a lot invested in this drug war, and especially the past strategies, which is going after kingpins, going after big seizures. And these are the kinds of metrics that Pena Nieto has talked about moving away from, because they're really not meaningful in terms of showing actual progress and citizen security. And so he's trying to reposition their strategy to focus more on, the more outrageous crimes of kidnapping, extortion, things that affect people's daily lives, rather than go after the kingpins and going after the kilo seizures and that sort of thing, which really do help U.S. drug warriors and hardliners justify their budgets. It's great for our politicians when they get to parade these kingpins around cameras and such, but it really doesn't do much to reduce the amount of drugs coming in the United States. So now, after anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 dead in Mexico after the past 5 years, to what end have they done this? Is anyone in their wildest imagination claiming that at the end of this process, the cartels will go away, they'll be destroyed? Nobody's claiming that. There'll be a different constellation of cartels, slightly different turf lines, but they'll go back to the quiet business of supplying North Americans with drugs. And so to what end have we done all this?
Jose Cardenas, though, President Obama, there we just saw, seemed to be saying, look, I'm withholding judgment, but, he presented this as perhaps an internal matter, a bureaucratic Mexican matter, perhaps. I mean, is that really their sense, or are they pretty concerned, do you think?
I believe that they're going to wait to hear from the Mexicans themselves how they intend to proceed from here. What I would say is, unfortunately, the article does resurrect concerns expressed when President Pena Nieto was first elected several months ago, that the PRI, his party, would be walking back the close association with the United States in the implementation of the drug war. And I think that is unfortunate. I do believe, however, that the United States will wait and see. There may very well be a more of a centralization of the prosecution of the war. How that will turn out in the end obviously remains to be seen. But I think there's a lot of concerns. I think that where we were headed with Mexico under President Calderon, even though it was taboo to say, was a sort of a symbiotic relationship that we maintain with Colombia in the prosecution of their drug war over the past decade, where you had across the board collaboration between U.S. officials and Colombian officials.
The problem is it wasn't working. And the problem is 60,000 people died and the drug flow continues.
But as was indicated in your opening segment, a lot of that was cartel on cartel violence in Mexico as a result of the pressure being put on the cartels by the government action.
So, Jose Miguel, I mean, that's an argument we always hear, that violence is a sign of success. And I guess after 60 to 100,000 dead, it can be difficult to argue that, I suppose. But that is the argument that many do still make.
Well, I think Jose has mentioned a couple of points that are quite valid. One is that the relationship between the Calderon administration and the first Bush and then Obama was very, very close. And but on a point that I disagree is that the 70,000 killings are the job done by the cartels. That is precisely what needs to be investigated in Mexico. And unfortunately, during the Obama administration, the Calderon administration received pretty much unconditional support from Washington to conduct his war on drugs, and without looking at the impact, the consequence, the cost, the human cost of 20,000 disappearances, torture cases. You know that during the whole period of President Calderon, there was not a single conviction for any security officer sentenced to prison for torture. And there is plenty of evidence of hundreds of cases of torture conducted by members of the Army and the Navy and the police. And the U.S. government, I think, has a particular responsibility on all of this because it has been financing, supporting, sharing intelligence, equipment to the security forces.
And you wrote a letter, actually, in your capacity as head of Human Rights Watch Americas to the White House yesterday.
That's right.
Basically accusing the White House of complicity
I don't think I went that far, but what I said was that President Obama has been pretty much silent on the public record with regard to the human rights abuses committed in Mexico.
But while being deeply involved in the actual operation.
That's right. So this, the whole point of the letter was to take advantage of this opportunity in Mexico to make crystal clear that, first of all, that human rights and security are not incompatible, concepts or values. That the best way to achieve security is by respecting human rights. But secondly, to acknowledge the vast number of victims of atrocities in Mexico, which, I believe that the U.S. government has some sort of shared responsibility.
And you're just back from the White House.
That's right.
Can you tell us anything about this?
I can't because the meeting was off the record. But the main point was to discuss some of the issues that we raised in that letter. Remember that all the cooperation with Mexico has been conditioned to certain human rights standards. The State Department has to certify that Mexico is making progress on human rights. And unfortunately, during the Obama administration, all of this time, the State Department has been certifying progress on human rights in spite of the evidence that shows
So what are you saying about the State
setbacks.
Department then? I mean,
I think
are they
that
willfully misleading us?
Well, I think it's, unfortunately, human rights took the back seat, during the whole relationship. And they probably understood that by raising concerns, public concerns on human rights, will damage the relationship. Now, there is a new administration, and the current administration in Mexico is pretty different on these issues. In other words, has shown some receptivity,
right,
and they are quite open to discuss human rights. So Obama should take advantage of this momentum to raise these concerns in Mexico.
But Sanho Tree, I mean, do you really think that is a concern of Washington again? I mean, these problems have been raised time and time again, but the vast array of agencies in Washington don't seem terribly concerned about human rights or the number of deaths. As far as they're concerned, again, I mean, the mantra is, well, the violence shows it's working.
Well, yeah, I think within government there are many different factions, and so the U.S. government is never a monolith. However, I think the hardliners have been historically in the driver's seat, and the drug warriors have always taken precedent over the human rights concerns, not just in Mexico, but many other countries as well. But even the Homeland Security's own internal studies, Customs and Border Protection, 2 or 3 years ago came out with their own study saying that the kingpin strategy has been a disastrous failure. It has increased violence. When you take out a kingpin, you create a power vacuum. You have lieutenants trying to take over that operation and fighting amongst themselves. You have other cartels trying to take over their turf. And you end up with new leadership that are often younger. They think with their testosterone rather than their brains. And they engage in a lot more of these turf battles. So it really doesn't help a whole lot.
But why do they cling to this strategy? If even as far as the amount of narcotics coming into the US, it's ostensibly failed. If the Homeland Security Department says that the strategy isn't failing, is it simply about turf battles and budgets, or is it about, I mean, what is going on? What's your suggestions on it?
Some of that makes for good television. You get to parade these kingpins in handcuffs in front of the television. You get to have seizures and burnings of tons and tons of cocaine. That looks good for a lot of the drug enforcement people to show Congress at next year's appropriation cycle, look what we've done. We've been effective. But in fact, there is an inexhaustible reservoir of poor, desperate young Mexicans who would rather live as king for a year and have a short life than as a pauper for a lifetime.
Jose Cardenas,
that has to do with the failure of economic policies.
I mean, that's quite a depressing thought, there, isn't it? That this is about.
I think that in the case of Mexico, and I keep reverting back to Colombia, which I think in many ways offers incredible lessons learned for those who participated in the prosecution of that strategy, is when you think of the alternative for Mexico. If Mexican citizens really want to go back to the days where you had a pact between the government and the cartels, each one just sort of leaves each other alone, pretty soon the entire sovereignty, as happened in Colombia, the sovereignty of your country is lost.
But if the alternative is tens of thousands of people dying each year, and of course, let's face it, the roots of this problem are in the US and elsewhere with demand. And if the US is going to do nothing about that, what choice do they have?
There's no way to sugarcoat a drug war. It is going to be violent. There are going to be innocent casualties. I do not know what is a better alternative. Decriminalization, legalization. As a father of teenagers, I'm not going to advocate for that. I believe that these criminal networks must be broken. And it's not an a la carte strategy. You can't pick A, B, and C and not do D, E, and F.
Jose Miguel, what do you make of that argument?
Well, but we can ignore the security problems of Mexico and Central America and Colombia as well, still now, by the way. And but if you're going to go after these cartels and organized crime, you need to do it professionally with security forces that are capable to operate in an environment where they will be accountable to somebody, where they are not going to proceed with brutality and full impunity, which is unfortunately the problem in Mexico.
Well, it was notable also in Dana's article, Sanho, that one of the people that the US realized they had to fight there were people that they themselves had trained elsewhere, the Cabillas from Guatemala, who again they trained, Guatemalan special forces, former members of that, who were known for their particular brutality of killing and torturing children and throwing people's bodies, while alive, into vats of acid. I mean, once again, though, Yeah, and yet they continue on with training more security forces to do more things. I mean, again, are lessons being learned, do you think?
Absolutely not, apparently, because it only takes a few bad apples to corrupt the whole bunch. So that you can vet all the colonels and majors you want, but if the general is on the payroll of the cartels, or the attorney general, or the drug czar, then all they have to do is sit down in the morning briefing and say, who are we going to hit next? That scene in the movie Traffic, where the U.S. drug czar goes down and bear hugs his Mexican general drug czar counterpart, that's based on real life. General McCaffrey actually did that.
But is this about drugs? I mean, you begin to wonder, though, when you see the ineffectiveness of this policy, and you hear about the turf wars and the sort of battles you're describing, Sanho. Is this really about drug interdiction? Is this about other political battles? Is this simply about power and a military presence and influence in Mexico?
Well, it's a confluence of a lot of things. So different organizations and different bureaucracies have different interests. A lot of it is budget-driven. A lot of it is turf-driven. But these people also rationalize to themselves, well, that's a couple of tons of cocaine that won't reach our streets in the United States. But the people who want cocaine have no problem finding it. So that's actually not helping the situation a whole lot. In fact, you're giving a price support to drug traffickers. It's a symbiotic relationship, all right. It's a symbiotic relationship between drug traffickers and drug warriors, because without the other, they cannot make a reasonable living.
And there was that interesting...
These are minimally processed agricultural commodities that are worth pennies per dose.
Interesting paragraph in Dana's article again, though, which says that the CIA did propose emptying the bank accounts of drug kingpins, but that was vetoed by the White House and the Treasury because it would cause too much havoc in the banking system because, frankly, that drug money is so important to the banking sector, frankly. I mean, it's all rather established, isn't it? Do we really want to get rid of it all then?
Well, I don't know the facts behind that incident, but I will say that an essential element to taking down these criminal organizations is financial, and seizing those assets, blocking the transfer of those monies. You choke that off, and you kill the beast.
Jose Miguel, I mean, you can't tell me what the White House said to you, but what did you say to them then, or what is the position that you have on policy moving forward? What would be a better way forward then?
Well, first of all, is in a problem of like Mexico is facing today, it's always better to use law enforcement agencies and not the army. The army is prepared for conflict, and the use of lethal force of the army is very, very different from law enforcement agencies. So they have to be able to build up the capacity.
So Pena Nieto has proposed, I mean, I haven't heard about it much recently, actually, but he did propose some sort of new gendarmerie.
That's right.
Is it clear that that's going to escape the same sort of pitfalls that the military and the police have fallen into in the past, not least human rights abuses and corruption and so forth?
Well, Pena Nieto has proposed several things. The problem is that we still don't know the details. We don't know the specifics of what about this gendarmerie of 10,000 officers with the support of the French government. What are going to be the rules of the game? How different is going to be that one from the federal police that Calderon tried to build? What is the new strategy to go after the cartels? Because he keeps talking about this, but there is no specifics. And in terms of human rights, he has been quite open, supporting victims, acknowledging the cost of the policies of the Calderon administration. But so far, he has to put some very, very concrete proposals to investigate those crimes.
And we've had Sanho quite often, and we've had Jose Cardenas on quite often, and we see that difference in policy. What's your opinion, though? I mean, usually Sanho's point certainly is, look, unless U.S. policy changes to drugs, then you're not going to really have too much of a change in the sort of levels of violence. I'm putting words in your mouth, Sanho, because we're running out of time. But I mean, and what about U.S. policy and what its role in the violence in Mexico?
Well, I think we welcome the debate about legalization or criminalization of at least drug consumption, drug possession. I think this is a real issue. The fact the fact that the U.S. is the biggest market for this is a serious problem. I mean, the administration acknowledged that there is a shared responsibility here, shared responsibility in terms of the trafficking of weapons going back to Mexico. But I think it's the most urgent problem is to stop these massive abuses committed by security forces in Mexico that are,
who we understand have been working so closely with the U.S. over the past 7 years.
Extremely closely, and even though the support was conditioned to specifics on human rights, the administration basically looked at the other way.
Jose Miguel Vivanco, thank you very much. Jose Cardenas, thank you. Sanho Tree, thank you very much as well. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Share your ideas with us on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story AM.